bags, dropped me off at my grandfather's isolated estate, and whispered, "We'll be back in a few weeks." They never returned. For nearly 2 decades, my grandfather raised me, loved me, and shielded me from the cold truth of their abandonment. But the moment his heart finally stopped beating, my parents suddenly reappeared at his funeral, clad in designer black and demanding their rightful slice of his rumored $100 million empire. They thought they were about to hit the ultimate jackpot and toss me out onto the street. Follow my story until the end and see how far my story has reached. Because when Grandpa's stone-faced attorney slowly unsealed the true final will, my parents smiled greedily until the lawyer began to read, and their faces instantly turned pale. My name is Chloe, and I am 26 years old. If you looked at me today, you would see a woman who stands tall, confident, and completely independent. But if you cast your mind back 17 years, you would find a terrified 9-year-old girl standing on a cold, concrete porch, clutching a single tattered suitcase with faded butterflies printed on the fabric. That was the day the heavy oak door of my life slammed shut behind me. My biological parents, Richard and Eleanor, didn't look back as they hurried down the driveway. I can still vividly hear the gravel crunching under the tires of their luxury sedan. Eleanor had patted my head with a gloved hand just moments before, offering a hollow, practiced smile. "We'll be back in a few weeks, sweetie," she had whispered, her voice carrying the exact same casual tone she used when ordering a morning latte. "Just a quick business trip." It was a lie. They never intended to return for me. To them, a child was an expensive liability, an obstacle blocking their path to a high society lifestyle they couldn't actually afford. As the taillights of their car vanished into the evening fog, the crushing weight of their abandonment settled deep into my chest. But before the tears could even blur my vision, a warm, calloused hand gently came to rest on my trembling shoulder. It was my Grandpa Arthur. He knelt down to my eye level, looked straight into my soul, and made a quiet promise that would rewrite my entire destiny. "You are safe now, Chloe," he said softly, his voice a steady anchor in the sudden storm. "This will always be your home." That very night, Arthur made a definitive choice. He completely severed ties with his ungrateful, greedy son and daughter-in-law, locking the gates of the estate to protect our peace, and beginning a quiet war they never saw coming. Growing up on Grandpa Arthur's massive, historic estate felt like living in a beautiful, shielded sanctuary. He was a self-made logistics tycoon, a man who had built a massive empire from absolute scratch, yet he chose to live incredibly humbly with me. We spent our evenings reading by the fireplace, baking bread, and discussing my school days. He gave me a magical childhood, but as I grew older, the golden haze began to lift, and the cold, shadowed truth of my reality started creeping in. I accidentally discovered that my biological parents hadn't just left me behind to pursue their glamorous dreams, they had actively erased me. When I tried calling them on my 12th birthday, the mechanical voice on the line informed me my number had been permanently blocked. Worse, I found old, hidden correspondence revealing that Richard and Eleanor had routinely harassed Arthur, demanding massive sums of cash just to leave the kid alone and keep their distance. They treated me like a pawn in a sick game of financial extortion. Arthur never let me see his pain, but he silently began preparing a counterattack. During my high school years, I noticed a distinct pattern. A sharp, intimidating estate lawyer named Marcus Vance began arriving at the house multiple times a week. They would lock themselves inside Arthur's private study for hours, surrounded by thick ledgers and stacks of corporate documents. Whenever I walked past the heavy door, the intense murmur of their voices would instantly fade into a dead, calculated silence. I didn't understand it then, but Arthur was quietly weaving a flawless net to trap the wolves. The peaceful sanctuary we had built came to a sudden, devastating halt. Move the timeline to the present day, to the darkest morning of my life. Grandpa Arthur passed away peacefully in his sleep at the ripe age of 84. When I found him, his face was calm, but my entire world completely shattered into a million pieces. The man who had been my father, my protector, and my truest friend was gone, leaving me entirely alone in the massive house. But the grief wasn't allowed to settle. Within a mere 24 hours of the news hitting the local papers, the vultures officially returned. Richard and Eleanor arrived at the estate entirely uninvited, sweeping through the front doors like they owned the place. They didn't shed a single, solitary tear for the man who gave them life. Instead, they immediately pulled out their phones, pacing through the grand hallways to catalog the expensive artwork, the antique furniture, and the rare sculptures. It was sickening. Before Arthur's body was even properly prepared for the ground, my biological father walked into the kitchen where I sat grieving and delivered a ruthless ultimatum. Richard looked down his nose at me, his voice dripping with a terrifying sense of entitlement. He told me that since Arthur was dead, the entire estate belonged to them by right of bloodline. "You've had a free ride for 17 years, Chloe," he sneered coldly. "You have until the end of this week to pack your things and clear out." The day of the funeral arrived, heavy with rain and suffocating tension. The chapel was filled with Arthur's old business associates and close friends, all mourning a great man, but the atmosphere was completely hijacked by the sheer audacity of my biological parents. Richard and Eleanor sat near the front, but their posture wasn't that of grieving family members. It was the stance of conquering conquerors. They were clad in pristine, custom-tailored designer black, looking more like they were attending a high-fashion gala than a final farewell. Right there in the public pews, completely unbothered by the judgmental stares of the weeping guests around them, they began loudly whispering about their grand future plans. I could hear Richard casually explaining to a colleague how they intended to liquidate the entire multi-million-dollar logistics business within a month, selling the historic properties off to foreign investors for a quick, massive cash payout. They were already spending money that wasn't theirs, completely erasing Arthur's lifetime of hard work before he was even lowered into the earth. But their public celebration was cut short. Just as the service concluded, Marcus Vance stepped forward from the shadows of the chapel. Wearing a sharp, perfectly pressed dark suit, his face looked as though it were carved from solid marble. He did not offer Richard or Eleanor a handshake. Instead, he stepped directly into their path, completely cutting off their conversation, and coldly informed them that an emergency reading of the will would take place immediately inside the church's private back office. The trap was finally set. Inside the church's private back office, the air felt thick and suffocating. Richard proudly strode in first, tossing a faded folder onto the center of the polished desk with an arrogant smirk. He loudly claimed that as Arthur's only living son, the rumored $100 million inheritance automatically defaulted to him by law. He pointed aggressively at an old estate planning document from 15 years ago, a piece of paper he had kept tightly guarded like a golden ticket. He truly believed his victory was guaranteed. Eleanor stood beside him, crossing her arms and looking at me with a condescending smile that practically told me to start counting my pennies. They were completely blinded by their own greed, basking in a false sense of absolute security. They thought they had successfully manipulated the system and erased me from the family tree. But Marcus Vance remained utterly unmoved by their grandstanding. He maintained a flawless, icy poker face as he pulled a thick manila folder from his leather briefcase. The room went completely dead silent as Vance slowly unsealed the envelope, his expression entirely unreadable as he adjusted his reading glasses. The crinkling of the paper sounded like a ticking time bomb. Richard and Eleanor leaned forward eagerly, their eyes practically glazing over with dollar signs as they waited for the massive financial numbers to be read aloud. They braced themselves for the moment their lives would change forever. Vance cleared his throat, looked up once to lock eyes with my parents, and began reading the true, updated final will, executed just 3 months before Arthur's passing. With a steady, monotone voice, Marcus Vance read the exact clause that instantly turned my parents' greedy smiles into expressions of pure horror. Grandpa Arthur hadn't left them his thriving logistics empire at all. Instead, he had left them the primary corporate shell companies, which were heavily encumbered by hundreds of millions of dollars in toxic debt, active federal lawsuits, and decades of unpaid back taxes. Arthur had systematically stripped the value from those specific entities, leaving behind a hollow, radioactive legal mess. Richard's breath hitched as the lawyer laid out the trap. Vance calmly explained that by aggressively claiming the estate through bloodline rights and signing the preliminary entry documents, Richard and Eleanor had legally and permanently assumed total personal liability for Arthur's old restructuring debts. They hadn't inherited a magnificent fortune. They had blindly signed their own financial death warrants. They were now personally responsible for debts that far exceeded everything they owned in the world. While my biological parents sat frozen in absolute shock, Vance turned his eyes to me and revealed the final piece of Arthur's master plan. The actual $100 million liquid fortune, the vast real estate portfolio, and the highly lucrative active logistics empire hadn't been destroyed. They had been quietly and completely transferred months ago into an unassailable, ironclad private trust. A trust that belonged entirely to me, managed by Vance until my 25th birthday, which had already passed. I was the sole heir to everything. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the room. Richard and Eleanor tried to scream, slamming their hands on the mahogany table and threatening a massive, endless legal war. But Marcus Vance didn't even blink. He calmly reached back into his briefcase and slid a binding non-disclosure and waiver agreement across the table. He looked my father dead in the eye and explained that if they attempted to fight the private trust, the overwhelming evidence of their past financial fraud and attempted extortion would be handed directly to federal authorities. They were completely silenced, their leverage instantly reduced to zero. I sat quietly as my biological parents retreated from the office in utter, humiliating defeat. It was then I realized that Grandpa Arthur had spent his final, painful months on Earth perfectly setting a trap for the wolves, ensuring they could never hurt me again. Today, I run the logistics empire for my charming new estate in Carmel, living the peaceful life he always wanted for me. But I'm curious about you. What would you do if the parents who abandoned you suddenly came back for your